If you were sitting in your own car
Don't
and a
leave,
beautiful
please, you
woman
have to
suddenly
help us.
sprinted toward you, hammering her hands against the windshield with eyes wide in sheer, unadulterated panic in the glaring light of day, would you lock the doors and leave her behind, or would you roll down the window to hear the price of the truth? Comment, lock, or talk right now, because this story is going to make you second-guess the very person sleeping beside you tonight. This noon, the sun hung suspended above the zenith of the skyscrapers, scorching and entirely apathetic. I turned the key in the ignition of my ancient sedan, the dilapidated engine shuddering beneath the chassis like an aging beast, struggling to rouse itself from a protracted slumber. The city streets hummed with life, yet my pawnshop sits on a stretch of road where people instinctively quicken their pace, as if terrified its decrepit, spectral facade might somehow ensnare their souls. Before I could even shift into gear, her silhouette materialized. Elena wasn't walking, she was running. A frantic, directionless kind of sprint, her erratic footsteps pounding against the blistering pavement, her breath escaping a petite mouth that had now gone terrifyingly pale. She wore a pale sky-blue t-shirt, the skin-tight fabric clinging to her hourglass figure, its plunging V-neck exposing porcelain skin drenched in a slick sheen of sweat under the unforgiving sun. Her lightly curled blonde hair cascaded down, plastered to cheeks speckled with tears that the wind had blown backward. As she threw herself against my car window, I could clearly hear her ragged breathing, a low, stifled rattling in her throat, the sound of a primal terror slowly suffocating her. I rolled down the window. No haste, just a quiet, calculating observation. In her eyes the irises had shrunk, pupils blown wide by a massive spike of adrenaline. That wasn't the gaze of a casual jogger, it was the stare of prey fleeing something invisible, yet decidedly lethal. She beat her hands against the glass, her slender, skeletal fingers trembling violently. "Please," she wheezed, her voice shattering in the open air. "You're Silas, aren't you? Don't go. It's too late. He's sending men after me. I have nowhere left to hide." I leaned back against the upholstery, studying the woman before me. Beneath the harsh daylight, every microscopic detail of her despair was entirely too stark. The faint, angry red welts circling her wrists looked as though she had just wrenched herself free from an invisible set of shackles. I have survived long enough in the fixer trade to know that when impossibly beautiful women stumble into your life consumed by absolute panic, it is usually the opening move of a chess match where you are the pawn, or worse, the sacrificial lamb. "Get in," my voice a low, even baritone. She didn't hesitate, ripping open the passenger door and collapsing inside. Her scent, a heady amalgamation of wildly expensive jasmine perfume suffocated by the sour tang of anxious sweat, instantly engulfed the claustrophobic confines of the sedan. I didn't ask her destination. I simply knew I had to pull her out of the crosshairs of whatever lenses were tracking her on this street. I eased the car forward, driving languidly, navigating through a labyrinth of familiar alleys and decrepit avenues known only to those intimately acquainted with the city's rotting underbelly. For the first 15 minutes, the silence was absolute. Elena sat there, her hands woven tightly together in her lap, her fingernails biting so deeply into her own flesh that crescent-shaped slivers of white bloomed beneath the skin. That sky-blue t-shirt, undeniably seductive in any other context, now looked tragically fragile, a paper-thin shield entirely incapable of repelling the cruel world outside. I watched her through the rearview mirror, noting how her eyes remained glued to the window, tracking every passing shadow as if every man on the sidewalk were an assassin dispatched by her husband. "Who is he?" I asked, my inquiry dropping like a heavy stone into the dead, still water of the car. Elena flinched. She twisted around, her blonde curls tumbling over her shoulders, her baby doll face now a smeared canvas of ruined makeup and dried tears. "He is a billionaire," she answered, her voice quivering but laced with a profound acidic bitterness. "But he isn't human. He is a calculating machine, a creature who breathes psychological manipulation. Silas, he is making me lose my mind." I swerved the car into a pitch-black alleyway, seeking refuge from the blinding sunlight cascading over the metropolis. Killing the engine in the shadow of a decaying brick tenement, the heavy silence reclaimed the space, leaving only the jagged rhythm of her gasps as the sole testament to the existence of her terror. "You say you're losing your mind," I began. my cold gaze sweeping over her devastated exterior. Tell me about it in the most agonizingly specific details. Spare me the florid adjectives. Tell me what it feels like the moment you wake up. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, resting her head against the seat. Every morning I wake up to a hollow, echoing void in my skull, as if someone had surgically excised a chunk of my memory from the night before. He continuously tells me I've done insane things, that I shredded crucial documents, that I screamed like a banshee at his business partners, that I mutilated my own skin. But I remember sleeping peacefully. I remember laughing, and then he hands me these supplements. He insists they are vitamins, something to help me find my center. But the moment I swallow them, the shadows begin to crawl. I hear incessant whispering bleeding through the drywall. I plunge into a blind panic, and right at that precise second he appears, gently cradling me, recording every second of my breakdown. He murmurs to me, "Darling, you're truly unwell. We need to put you somewhere safe." He is filming my psychological execution, Silas. He is orchestrating a spectacle to convince the entire world that I lack the sanity to inherit my father's empire. I listened, absorbing every single syllable. The dormant fixer instincts inside my brain began snapping the puzzle pieces together, a gaslighting campaign of monumental, terrifying proportions. The husband didn't need to murder her. He merely needed her breathing, yet trapped within the hollow shell of a psychiatric patient. Once deemed incompetent, the legal authority over her vast inheritance would automatically default to his hands via their prenuptial agreement. It was a flawless script, penned in the ink of pure malice and predatory greed. "Do you still have the pills?" I asked. She rummaged through her miniature handbag, producing a small, dark amber glass vial containing a few opaque white capsules. I took it, lifting the glass to catch the mere light filtering into the alley. The casing looked utterly unremarkable, but the scent, a faint, acrid bitterness of synthetic chemicals that an amateur would easily dismiss. Those were no vitamins. They were a low-grade psychotropic drug, just enough to induce severe cognitive dissonance, yet sophisticated enough to remain undetected in standard blood panels if the private physician had already been bought and paid for. "How far did you run?" I abruptly pivoted the interrogation. From my estate, in the upper-class district, I sprinted all the way here after eavesdropping on his phone call with his private doctor. He said that this Friday's shareholder meeting would be the grand finale. He plans to broadcast the videos of my psychotic episodes. I ran because I knew I had absolutely no other window of escape. I looked out the window. The brilliant sunshine outside seemed to mock the rotting despair festering within the shadows of this car. Elena, with her voluptuous silhouette and immaculate, doll-like beauty, now looked excruciatingly small and fragile in that skin-tight ensemble. She resembled a priceless porcelain figurine misplaced on a filthy street corner, her limbs slowly being snapped off, piece by piece, by the avaricious hands of her billionaire husband. But the man had made one fatal miscalculation. He had chosen a victim who knew how to run, and more importantly, he had allowed her to stumble right to the front door of Silas's pawnshop. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my eyes never leaving the amber vial. "Help me stay sane," she whispered, her hand clamping down on my forearm. The feverish heat of her flesh radiated through her t-shirt, a desperate, tactile craving for survival. "Help me take back what is mine and make him pay." I slipped the vial into my pocket. "Fine," I replied, my tone glacial, "but you will listen to me. From this precise second onward, you cease to be a victim. You are my chess piece. Do you have the stomach for this game?" Elena looked at me, her eyes plunging into depths that seemed to harbor a brewing tempest. The panic had evaporated, replaced by a chilling, calcified resolve. She nodded. That was the moment I knew the board was set. Behind the grimy glass of that dilapidated pawnshop, I didn't just hoard pledged trinkets. I harbored secrets capable of incinerating entire empires to ash. And that billionaire, currently sitting in his opulent office with its panoramic view of the skyline, was entirely ignorant of the fact that his own hubris had driven his wife straight into the arms of a man like me, a man with absolutely nothing to lose, intimately fluent in the vicious rules of the aristocratic elite. The shadows in the alleyway began to stretch and warp. I turned the ignition, the engine roaring back to life, though this time it sounded like a declaration of war. Elena's life, the billionaire's empire, and my own shadowy reputation, all of it now dangled precariously by the fraying thread of a grand deception poised to be unraveled. We pulled out of the alley, merging back into the chaotic arteries of the metropolis, a place where the truth is routinely buried beneath the heavy, suffocating cloaks of luxury. But this time, the truth would not lie dormant in the dirt. It would return, come Friday, right in the freezing epicenter of the boardroom where power is carved up and devoured. And I, Silas, would be the ghostwriter drafting the final, fatal chapter of the psychological thriller that her husband had so arrogantly authored. That bastardized novel, ironically enough, was penned in the invisible ink of saccharine flattery and opaque white capsules. The rattling growl of the sedan finally sputtered and died as I pulled into the cramped back lot, surrendering to the viscous, heavy silence of the pawnshop. Darkness in this neighborhood doesn't descend gently. It collapses like a dust-choked velvet curtain. I shoved open the rusted iron door, the unoiled hinges in a bone-jarring shriek that violently tore through the suffocating air, reeking of mothballs, decaying plywood, and the acrid, metallic tang of oxidizing copper coins. Elena trailed behind me, her footsteps eliciting weak, agonizing creaks from the rotting floorboards. The temperature shop was at least 5 degrees colder than the street, a damp, subterranean chill bleeding directly from the unplastered brick walls and sinking straight into the flesh. I saw her give a subtle shudder. That tight, sky-blue t-shirt, which had so vividly accentuated her radiant allure beneath the midday sun, now clung to a body plagued by rhythmic tremors, cold and ragged like the discarded husk of a molting serpent. "Sit," I ordered, jerking my chin toward the cracked, peeling leather sofa in the corner, where the solitary, jaundiced glow of a street lamp bled through a cobwebbed window pane. She collapsed into the cushions, her eyes squeezing shut. That I could hear the excruciating labor of her every breath, the friction of her rising chest against the cotton fabric, and the sharp, sibilant hiss pulling through her teeth, as the chemical cravings, or rather, the physiological withdrawal, from that godforsaken psychotropic poison began to gnaw savagely at her nervous system. I did not fetch her a warm glass of water, nor did I offer any hollow platitudes. In my world, pity is the most lethal toxin of all. I walked over to my makeshift dilapidated bar, pouring a neat glass of bourbon. The amber liquid burned a fiery trail down my throat and into my gut, shocking the weary senses of an aging fixer back to life. The game was afoot, and I needed my mind colder than glacial ice. For the subsequent 2 days, the rotting wooden low-D sign dangled listlessly from the front door. The world outside continued its dizzying rotation, but inside this cramped, dust-choked purgatory, time seemed to freeze entirely. I left Elena to physically wrestle with her night terrors and the violent tearing of her fractured memories. Occasionally, in the dead of the night, I could hear her dragging her sharp fingernails across the leather upholstery, a horrifying scratching resonance like rats gnawing frantically at a wooden bulkhead. She was being drained completely. The chemicals were fleeing her system, dragging the hallucinatory fog with them, leaving behind a stark, excruciating, and naked reality. While she was independently purging the chaotic debris within her own cerebral cortex, I commenced the cleanup of the external chessboard. The true artistry of a fixer does not lie in pulling a trigger. It lies in knowing the exact structural bolt to loosen so that a colossal machine inevitably grinds itself to dust. Her husband, Richard, a name gilded across the cover of every premier tech magazine, was not a target you could approach with a switchblade or brute force. He was a fortress. But every fortress possesses a sewage drain, and his drain was his private psychiatrist. As dusk bled into the sky, the oppressive humidity heralded a brewing summer squall. I draped my ash-gray trench coat over my shoulders, abandoning my sanctuary to infiltrate the upper echelons of the elite. The commercial downtown was choked with the cloying scent of exorbitant perfumes, premium roasted espresso, and the stench of sheer arrogance, all artificially refrigerated by sub-zero central air conditioning. It didn't take an agonizing amount of time to tail and corner the doctor's assistant in a subterranean, cigar-smoke-drenched lounge on the east side. No violence was required. A mere handful of photographs documenting a mountain of gambling debts, combined with a thick, icy stack of cash slid beneath the table, and I possessed a cloned keycard granting unfettered access to the clinic's private medical archives. That night, the summer tempest finally broke, hurling heavy, brutal sheets of water against the corrugated tin roof of the pawnshop, generating a deafening, relentless barrage like the beating of war drums. Back in the rear quarters, bathed in the sickly, flickering luminescence of an archaic computer monitor radiating a sweltering heat, I began hacking my way into the psychological labyrinth the billionaire had so meticulously engineered. The atmosphere inside the room grew unnervingly cold, not due to a drop in the thermostat, but because an entity of pure, unadulterated evil was materializing before my eyes, line by line of data. These were not simply prescriptions penned with incorrect dosages. This was the script to a psychological horror film, directed and curated down to the microscopic frame. I hit play on an audio file classified as top secret. The grating static of audio interference hissed through the speakers, harmonizing with the rain lashing the window panes. Then Richard's voice bled into the room, deep, velvety, dripping with profound concern, a tonal frequency capable of seducing and deceiving any jury on the face of the earth. "Darling, you've shredded that contract again. Don't you remember? The doctor warned us your paranoia is escalating. Please, take your medication. I'm here. I will protect you." What followed were the rhythmic, gut-wrenching sobs of Elena, the shattering crash of glass, and her desperate, shrieking denials of actions she had never committed. A cold sweat seeped from the palms of my hands. The sheer sadism lay not in the act of poisoning her, but in the fact that he was actively filming and recording the agonizing process of her psychological demolition. He was fabricating crime scenes, displacing objects, injecting artificial memories directly into her psyche the second the drugs began blurring her cognition, and then rolling the cameras to capture her breaking point as her grip on reality dissolved. He never intended to murder his wife. A dead spouse invites a labyrinth of exhaustive homicide investigations and probate legalities. But a wife officially declared legally incapacitated, remanded to emergency psychiatric conservatorship, he would legitimately and legally swallow her family's entire empire whole with absolutely no one possessing the authority to intervene. I killed the monitor. The computer tower's cooling fan shrieked in an exhausted rattle before dying on silence. In the pitch black, a jagged streak of lightning violently slashed across the window, illuminating Elena's deathly pale visage. She was standing framed in the doorway, a thin blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her blonde hair now a chaotic, tangled mess. Her eyes were impossibly wide, boring directly into my soul. She had heard everything. "Every time I hear his voice," Elena spoke, her tone a raspy, hollow wheeze, as if sandpaper had been viciously dragged across her vocal cords, "I smell lavender." He always lit lavender-scented candles right before he forced those pulls down my throat. Now, if I merely close my eyes, that damned fragrance suffocates my lungs. I closed the distance between us. The ambient heat radiating from my body clashed with the freezing aura emanating from hers. "You've survived the worst of the withdrawals," I stated, my voice a dry, gravelly rasp. "Is your brain clean enough to process the truth now? He is no fairy tale demon. He is a businessman, and you are simply a hemorrhaging financial asset he needs to liquidate. This Friday, at the shareholder summit, he is going to render you an absolute invalid before the eyes of the global press. He is going to broadcast these tapes." Elena's jaw locked. The grinding of her teeth emitted a faint but razor-sharp, agonizing crunch. Her hands seized the folds of the blanket so violently her knuckles blanched a ghostly white. The hysterical tears were gone. The impulse to flee was dead. Deep within those hollowed eyes that had finally regained their focal clarity, I witnessed a minuscule yet lethally toxic inferno sparking to life. It was the fire of absolute, unadulterated vengeance, an ember incubated in the womb of pure despair and betrayal. "What must I do?" She enunciated every single syllable, her feverish breath ghosting into the freezing air separating us. "We are not going to expose him," I replied, pivoting toward an antique oak cabinet decaying in the corner of the room. The brass hinges wailed in protest as I yanked the drawer open. The arid, earthy stench of dried herbs and bitter roots immediately assaulted my olfactory senses. Blowing the whistle on a billionaire commanding the most ruthless legal armada on the eastern seaboard is an act of suicide. Who will a jury believe, a visionary entrepreneur or a woman with a documented psychiatric history? No, Elena. He who wields psychology as a murder weapon must perish by the blade of psychology. I placed a minuscule glass vial on the tabletop. It did not contain the opaque white psychotropics supplied by the corrupted doctor. It housed a pale brown powder, painstakingly pulverized by my own hands from an exceedingly rare botanical root I had hoarded during my years navigating the underground. What is this? She approached, the fading ghost of her jasmine's perfume intertwining with the pungent, earthy musk of the herbs. It isn't a lethal poison. Nor is it a narcotic, I smirked, a rare, terrifyingly frigid expression. It is a hyper-potent, organic stimulant. It doesn't stop the heart. It merely annihilates all neurological inhibitions, forces the pupils into maximum dilation, skyrockets the heart rate, and hurls the subject into a state of extreme paranoid euphoria for a span of several hours. Physiologically and psychologically, it mimics the apex of a colossal overdose on synthetic amphetamines. I tilted my head, looking directly into Elena's eyes. Lightning flashed once more, highlighting the sociopathic neutrality of my expression. Your flawless husband perpetually relies on his icy composure to dominate the globe, I whispered, my voice weaving through the torrential downpour outside. Tomorrow when you return to that palatial estate, playing the role of the remorseful wife, obediently swallowing whatever pills he hands you, we will ensure that whatever he ingests right before he steps onto that podium to address the board of directors is in fact this powder. He wants to show the world how mad you are. Then we will show the world precisely how pathetic the brain of a technological deity looks when it detonates from the inside out. An absolute, crushing stillness enveloped the pawnshop. There was only the drumming rain, the patient, rhythmic ticking of the geriatric grandfather clock, and Elena's steady, recalibrated breathing. She extended her hand, her elongated, elegant fingers grazing the glass vial, shimmering beneath the sickly yellow light. The earthy bitterness of the root seemed to finally exorcise the haunting phantom of lavender from her mind. A silent blood pact was forged in the shadows between a retired fixer and the vengeful hunger of a fallen heiress. The labyrinth of psychological torture the billionaire had constructed was officially inverted, and now he was the one blindly wandering straight into the jaws of the trap. That trap was not strung with razor wire or hidden punji sticks. It was woven seamlessly from the threads of his own boundless, fatal hubris. At 8 o'clock on Friday morning, the city skyline was smothered by a bruised, slate-gray overcast, as thick as molten lead threatening to crush the rooftops. I stood stationed inside the audiovisual control room, concealed behind a pane of one-way black glass, staring directly down into the cavernous executive boardroom on the 42nd floor. The atmosphere in here was freezing. An artificial chill pumped through colossal ventilation ducts, carrying the sterile scent of synthetic pine and the faint, chemical tang of fresh carpeting. The server racks hummed a low, droning bass in my ear, a steady, muffled vibration like the pulse of a mechanical heart. I adjusted the collar of my ash-gray maintenance uniform, my fingertips lightly tracing the contours of the master control console. The stage was perfectly set. Last night, Elena had voluntarily walked back into her cage. She wore the impeccable disguise of the docile, panicked, and hopelessly contrite wife. The absolute submission of a terrified beast backed into a corner, always the most flawless theatrical performance. And while Richard, her billionaire warden, was intoxicating himself with a glass of celebratory vintage wine, basking in his wife's fabricated capitulation, she had covertly gutted the contents of his daily supplement capsules, replacing them with the pulverized root from my shop. He had ingested them alongside his breakfast this morning. The opaque white gelatin capsules, pregnant with the pale brown powder, had slid smoothly down his esophagus with a sip of exorbitantly priced espresso. He was entirely oblivious to the reality that, alongside his morning coffee, he had just swallowed the death warrant for his entire empire, 9 o'clock on the dot. The massive solid oak doors of the boardroom swung inward, emitting a heavy, authoritative thud. Richard entered, He was clad in a navy blue, bespoke suit tailored to a microscopic degree of perfection, his hair slicked back into an impenetrable, glossy helmet. Even through the soundproof glass, I could practically smell the suffocating aura of his Tom Ford cologne, a heavy miasma of patchouli and sandalwood, the distinct odor of a man who firmly believed he possessed the divine right to stand upon the throats of thousands. He strode forward with the majestic swagger of a monarch preparing to distribute alms. Trailing in his wake were the board members, the most ruthless venture capitalists on the eastern seaboard, men and women draped in tens of thousands of dollars of haute couture, yet harboring the cold, predatory eyes of vultures circling a carcass. They took their seats, the dry rustling of Manila dossiers scraping against the polished walnut table, the subtle shifting of bodies against premium leather chairs, and the quiet, polite clearing of throats mingled with the rich aroma of espresso wafting through the expansive void. Richard ascended the podium. The temperature in the room seemingly plummeted a few extra degrees in deference to the crowd's hushed anticipation. He offered a smile, a warm, impeccably programmed gesture. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice resonated through the surround sound acoustics, full, velvety, devoid of a single ripple of anxiety. "Today we gather to discuss the sustainable expansion of this conglomerate. But before we delve into the sterile calculus of our margins, I am compelled, as a husband, to share a deeply agonizing truth." He paused for a calibrated beat, bowing his head in a pantomime of suppressing some invisible, unbearable sorrow. It was a display of acting so remarkably repulsive I could literally taste a sour burst of bile crawling up my throat. "My wife, Elena, is enduring a catastrophic psychological collapse. Severe paranoia has robbed her of her lucidity. I have desperately tried to veil it, tried to shield her public image, but the situation has spiraled entirely beyond my containment. To safeguard the future of this empire, and more vitally, to facilitate her transition into an emergency psychiatric conservatorship, I am forced to present to you this heartbreaking evidence." He extended his hand, pressing his index finger against the remote control resting on the podium to trigger the colossal screen looming behind him. He intended to broadcast his fabricated cinematic masterpiece, the maliciously spliced footage of Elena screaming in terror as she was force-fed mind-altering drugs. But my finger had already engaged a completely different switch on the master console 3 seconds prior. The gargantuan LED screen did not illuminate with images of Elena's manufactured hysteria. It remained pitch black, a darkness as thick and suffocating as an abyss, and then rather than a visual feed, audio violently detonated across the chamber. It was not the audio from his video file, but the highly classified recording I had ripped from the psychiatrist's secure server. The screeching static of raw sound waves grinding against the speaker cones pierced the air. Then Richard's own voice echoed, but devoid of its current velvety warmth. It was a tone of razor-sharp, calculating, and purely demonic intent. "Increase the dosage by 50%. I do not need her getting a good night's sleep. I need her witnessing phantoms crawling out of the drywall. I need her screaming her lungs out the moment I hit record. Just 2 more months, and when this psychiatric file is legally codified, her family's entire voting bloc defaults to me. Get it done and your gambling debts are wiped clean." That audio clip dropped like a monolithic glacier into the center of a room boiling over with corporate machinations. The ensuing silence was so profoundly terrifying I could actually hear the dry, raspy swallow of an elderly shareholder in the front row. The atmosphere instantaneously flash froze. Countless eyes, initially dazed, paralyzed by shock, then rapidly curdling into toxic suspicion, skewered the man standing at the podium. Richard froze in a state of absolute paralysis, the hand clutching the remote violently seized. He frantically mashed the buttons in a desperate bid to kill the audio feed, but I had already severed his local override privileges from my console. The recording simply looped, regurgitating that filthy, damning truth over and over again. This is a grotesque misunderstanding, an AI-generated fabrication," he stammered into the microphone. But he had no time to elaborate, because at that exact, catastrophic millisecond, the chemical catalyst within his bloodstream achieved critical mass. The crushed root that had lain dormant in his stomach for 2 hours, now hyper-pressurized by the explosive surge of terror-induced adrenaline, breached the blood-brain barrier and rocketed directly into his cerebral cortex. From my hidden vantage point, I clinically observed every biological mutation of a man being viciously betrayed by his own anatomy. Richard's pupils dilated to their absolute physiological limits, transforming his irises into two gaping black sinkholes. His core temperature skyrocketed. I could clearly see beads of sweat the size of pearls erupting across his forehead, cascading down his temples, and thoroughly saturating his pristine starched white collar. He began to hyperventilate. His breath rasped through his clenched teeth in a wet, rattling wheeze, like a man drowning on dry land. The silk tie constricting his throat suddenly morphed into a suffocating hangman's noose. He clawed at it, violently ripping the tie away and tearing the top button of his shirt in a spasm of mindless, involuntary panic. "It's too hot. Don't you people feel how suffocating it is in here?" he babbled into the microphone, his cadence suddenly fracturing into a shrill, hysterical pitch. The chemical euphoria utterly obliterated the impenetrable, icy mask of the billionaire. He stumbled backward, his hands slapping wildly against the LED screen. Kaleidoscopic waves of hallucinatory colors began to drown his visual field. Trapped in the apex of a chemically induced high, his psychological defenses crumbled to dust, surrendering the throne to profound, raving paranoia. He glared down at the assembled board members, his eyes rolling, feral and seething with aggressive hostility. "What the hell are you looking at?" he shrieked, the raw screech amplified by the PA system violently rattling the eardrums of every soul in the room. "You think I'm the villain here, you pack of hypocrites? Every single one of you sitting in those chairs is a parasite gorging on her family's wealth. I'm merely the one setting the damn table for you. Ha ha ha." He burst into laughter, a shrill, manic, psychotic cackle, a sound that could only tear its way out of the throat of a creature entirely stripped of its humanity. He jabbed a trembling finger at the chairman of a colossal hedge fund, flecks of a slime flying from lips that were now violently twitching. "You! It was just last week you were begging me to figure out a way to get her out of your sight, and now you're going to play the saint?" The chamber exploded. Chaos metastasized like a ravenous wildfire. Nervous whispers mutated into full-throated shouts of absolute outrage. Heavy leather chairs were violently shoved aside, skidding across the floor with ear-piercing shrieks of friction. The intoxicating perfume of high society evaporated entirely, replaced by the rancid, metallic stench of exposed treachery. Richard was publicly tearing his own flesh from his bones, feeding his career, his legacy, and his monumental ego straight into a woodchipper before dozens of the most powerful eyes in the city. And then, precisely as the pandemonium crested its zenith, the colossal oak doors swung open once more. The roaring cacophony was instantly severed in half. Every single eye in the room snapped toward the threshold. The temperature in the room underwent a visceral shift. A wave of freezing, terrifyingly majestic air flooded the space. Elena walked in. She was no longer the sweat-drenched, fleeing jogger desperately pounding on the glass of my sedan. She was not wearing that sky-blue t-shirt that projected such fragile, seductive vulnerability. Today she was armored in an obsidian black power suit, the razor-sharp tailoring encasing her hourglass figure, radiating a glacial aura that practically dared anyone to hold her gaze. The lightly curled blonde hair that had once whipped wildly in the wind was now pulled back into an immaculate, unforgiving chignon at the nape of her neck. She walked, the rhythmic strike of her stiletto heels against the marble floor echoing with a sharp, metronomic clack-a-clack, as piercing and definitive as the strike of a judge's gavel. The scent of jasmine was entirely eradicated. All that remained was the suffocating presence of an iron will. She marched directly past the rows of gaping, awestruck executives and ascended the podium. Richard, now kneeling on one knee, clutching his spinning, hallucinatory skull, looked up at her. Within his blown-out, dilated eyes, the megalomania had been entirely ground into dust, leaving only a vacuum of absolute, paralyzing terror. The exact brand of terror he had sadistically forced down her throat every single day. "Alina," he rasped, lifting a violently trembling hand toward her, begging for a final pathetic lifeline. She did not flinch away, nor did she scream. The most terrifying form of vengeance is not delivered through hysterical tears or physical blows. It resides in absolute apathy. Elena cast her eyes down at the ruin of a man groveling at her feet, her gaze so horrifyingly frigid it could have instantly coagulated the chemically boiling blood in his veins. "Call security," Elena commanded, her voice terrifyingly placid, crisp, echoing through the dead silence of the room. "Remove this deranged man from my company, and contact the police department immediately. We have a felony poisoning to prosecute." The thunderous stampede of the security detail echoed almost instantly. They hauled Richard upward by his armpits. He thrashed, shrieking incomprehensible, psychotic gibberish, thick trails of saliva pouring down his chin. The majestic portrait of a visionary billionaire had been reduced to a pathetic mass of paranoid, unkempt flesh, dragged mercilessly across the very carpets he had once so arrogantly stalked. The heavy thud of the doors slamming shut cleanly severed that agonizing auditory nightmare. Elena turned, facing the entirety of the board. She rested her hands on the edges of the podium, assuming the posture of an absolute sovereign holding the keys to life and death. She offered no explanations. The truth had just vividly manifested itself. From behind the one-way glass, I watched her. She tilted her chin up slightly, her gaze sweeping past the recessed ceiling lights, and for a fleeting quarter of a second, her eyes locked onto the black pane of glass shielding me. No smiles were exchanged. There was no cliché, romantic closure, no theatrical nod of the hero. There was bottomless stare, Magas, a silent, blood-soaked acknowledgement between two souls who had waded through the exact pitch-black swamp of human depravity and emerged with their hands stained by the grime of psychological warfare. The chess match was over. The pawn had been crowned queen. I killed the audio breakers, packed my gear, and silently turned my back, melting into the shadows of the fire escape. The engine of my sedan growled once more, leaving the glittering epicenter of wealth behind, carrying its layers of grime back to my own shadowy, spectral corner of the world. Back in the pawnshop at twilight, the darkness had already begun slithering through the cracks in the masonry. I poured the last dregs of bourbon from the bottle, watching the viscous liquid catch the jaundiced, decaying light. The smell of rotting plywood wrapped around me. Familiar, secure. Elena was now seated at the absolute pinnacle of her empire, flanked by a new legion of sycophants signing a new era of contracts. She had reclaimed her cage. Only this time she was the one holding the keys. People often savor the tales of high society romance like gilded, decadent candies, sweet and glittering. But after scrubbing the blood and filth from this rotting mess, I was struck by a brutal, suffocating truth. The most lethal threat sharing your bed is not the one clutching a knife beneath the pillow. The most dangerous predator is the one who strokes your hair with a gentle smile, quietly penning a flawless script, whispering counterfeit affections on an endless loop until you look into the mirror and genuinely believe your own mind is fracturing. How many of us are wandering like ghosts inside a cage we desperately hallucinate to be a home, simply because we were too trusting, too weak to defy the lies we were forced to swallow every single day? Do not rush to answer. Take a deep, ragged breath, most terrifying corner of your own psyche, and ask yourself, if you were thrown into Elena's nightmare, would you possess the absolute clarity and ruthlessness required to realize you were being puppeteered, or would you slowly compromise, obediently swallowing those pills and accept your fate as a soulless pawn in someone else's game? Write your thoughts down below. I will read every single one. I'll see you on the next shift when the desperate secrets come knocking on my pawnshop door once again. Silas out.